What is everything that goes into making a garment? And can we create a piece of clothing entirely locally? I'm going to find out. Similar to the 100-mile diet or farm to table movement, I've challenged myself to apply this concept to clothing and see if we can create a garment from start to finish in Edmonton and Alberta. My name is Erin, and this is the ultimate slow fashion journey. We're going to explore the entire process from farm to closet. In the previous episode, the yarn was woven into custom fabric, and it's finally time to cut and sew this coat. This is it, the final stage of making this local coat. I have my lovely finished fabric with the stripes positioned according to our plan, and now need to cut it all out. Because I don't have any spare fabric and there's no room for mistakes, in preparation of cutting, I first went over all my pattern pieces to triple check for any errors and also revisited my final prototype. When I was confident all the pattern pieces were ready, I rolled out the fabric and started to cut them out. Working with a hand-woven fabric like this requires extra care. Because the yarns are thicker and the weave is looser, areas can get stretched or pulled at an angle, so you really have to ensure it's all flat and straight. In the last episode, we learned about the warp and the weft on a loom. The warp being the yarns under tension, and the weft is the one that goes left and right through them. And understanding warp and weft is very important for cutting and sewing a garment. And on patterns, the warp is marked as the grain line to align your pieces to. Now, because the warp is under tight tension during weaving, it is the sturdiest and least likely to stretch. So you can take advantage of that. Think of a pair of pants. The warp should run perfectly vertical, and this is because it's fine to have a little give around the leg or, across the thighs or hips, but you don't want any loosening or stretching down the length of the leg, or you'll end up with saggy knees over time. So then, if you cut something crooked or even a little bit off grain or off the warp, it can stretch and twist weirdly. And this is why sometimes, especially with cheaply made clothing, after washing the garment, it can look or fit not quite right. Maybe you've experienced a pair of pants, for example, where the side seam twists a little bit to the front or back. Bending or twisted seams are the most common sign that a garment was cut a bit off from the grain line. And this is why understanding how weaving translates to sewing is so important. Cutting needs to be done carefully, and the angle from the warp a piece is cut can make a huge difference in the fit, look, and longevity of a garment. So I carefully laid and cut all my pattern pieces out. And then it was time to sew, and here is where I ran into a roadblock. When I started this project, my goal was to make a garment entirely locally and from 100% local materials. But there is no local thread that can work in a sewing machine. I could hand sew the entire coat with the wool yarn, but that would take a lot more time. And I also have deadlines with the filming of this project, so I made the decision to use my sewing machine. I do still want the garment to be entirely natural and biodegradable, so instead of polyester thread, which is what most of our clothes are sewn with, I'm using organic cotton thread. But this is unfortunately one component which I could not source locally. I am still doing a lot of hand sewing with the wool yarn though. For example, all of the raw edges, I'm doing a blanket stitch on to finish them. Commercially, fabric edges are usually sewn with a serger to keep them from fraying, but I wanted to still use the local wool where possible. And even though my hand stitching isn't the most neat and perfect, I also think the handwork adds a special detail to the inside. I also use hand sewing to create a blind hem, so there's as little stitching on the outside as possible. Now, two other areas I ran into in terms of local sourcing were lining and interfacing. There are unfortunately no local materials for either. And while it's of course nice to have a lined coat, I also didn't make this coat to be a winter coat, and I decided early on that I was okay with having it unlined. The interfacing was trickier to work around though, but I was able to avoid it as well. Interfacing is a material used to help stabilize fabric. I did consider this when I was designing the coat though, and created something that didn't rely on a lot of stabilization or interfacing. The two areas of the coat where stabilization is the most important are the shoulders and the neckline. You don't want them stretching out weirdly. So I created an inner piece called a facing to help stabilize the shoulder, and I stitched extra wool into it to keep the weave from stretching. The back of the neck was the most tricky though. This area can very easily stretch out, especially with the weight of the garment pulling on those curves. So I could use something like this cotton twill tape to keep it from stretching, but I wanted to see if I could still use the wool. So the best solution was to do more hand stitching along the curves to support them. And I also used the iron and steam to help the wool stitching really set in. We've learned previously about how the scales on the wool fibers can tangle together and shrink and felt into a stiff fabric. And this property can actually be used to your advantage when you're working with wool. You can almost sculpt wool. For example, I could use a curve like this and steam and heat to help shape the wool. If edges get stretched out, you can also press them back into shape. And I can also slightly shrink the areas that are most likely to stretch out to help prevent them from stretching so much. So while it was a challenge to not have some of these materials like interfacing, it also was fun to try and problem solve and figure out ways to work around it and work with the materials I did have. Because of this fabric having quite a loose weave, the sewing machine can really stretch out the seams, especially any curves because again, they're off that grain. So I had to use a special attachment called a walking foot, which moves up and down as the needle moves instead of just pressing like a regular sewing foot does. And so this helps reduce the amount the fabric will stretch out of shape while sewing. The coat also needed a button closure at the neck. And for buttons, I had a few options for materials. I could do ceramic, something like this, but it is quite heavy and the button is also hidden unless the coat is open. So using a fancy button doesn't make much sense. Carved antler buttons are also an interesting local option. This one is made from fallen antlers, but I couldn't find anyone locally that was currently making them, and I would need something flatter than this one. And there's also wooden buttons, so I decided to go with this one. If I had more time, I would have actually attempted to cut my own wooden button, but I already had a few of these and it was a great size for the coat. If I want to though, I can still always replace it with a super local wooden button. Also, because of the fabric and special walking foot needed, I couldn't do a regular buttonhole with my sewing machine. So I stitched where I wanted the buttonhole and then needed to hand sew the buttonhole edges. And once that was all done, the final thing to add were the pockets. When I was testing my designs and patterns, I initially planned for welt pockets like this. And this is a great example of why slower fashion and making time to test patterns and do mock-ups is so important, because pockets like this actually don't work well for this design. I stitched a line here to represent the dyed stripe to check positioning, but as you can see, the pocket actually distorts the stripe, and the stripe would get even more wavy with the weight of the pocket. Since the main design detail is this bold stripe, I need that line to be straight and not wavy. So the best option for pockets would be to move them into the side seam here. But practically, I don't like coat pockets all the way over on the side. So I'm going to be doing a patch pocket on top instead, and I have a unique idea of how to stitch it. When I was at Swish Vintage looking at their coats, there was one which had a patch pocket, which had no top stitching around the edges, which is quite difficult to do. I have made a garment before with pockets like that, and it's very tricky to sew. So I was thinking about maybe doing something like that again, because I wanted as little visible lines and stitching as possible. But then while I was hand sewing the coat, I had a new idea. I cut an extra large pocket and removed the parallel yarns from the edges. So there were all of these loose yarns, which I then stitched through the coat to hold it on. It was very time consuming. I had to do it all by hand, but the result is a pocket with no visible stitching. It looks a little funny on the inside, but on the outside, it blends in as much as it possibly could. And this is one of those secret or special details where the average person probably wouldn't notice or care, but any sewers will definitely appreciate a detail like that. It's something small, but really takes a piece up a notch. I've honestly lost track of how much time I've spent sewing and finishing this coat, but after weeks of cutting and sewing, it is finally done. But wait, because when the fabric was woven, there was some leftover dyed yarn. And in my initial design, I was hoping that it could also be worn belted. So while I was sewing the coat, Christopher was weaving the leftover yarn into a belt.
Weaving for me was very happen chance. I'm a Métis citizen of the Alberta Métis Nation, and I was at the annual gathering one year, a couple of years back, and their art collective was looking for various artists to sign up and volunteer to take a weaving course. And at the time, I really didn't know much about it, and they taught the group of us how to weave so that we could bring sash weaving back to the Métis Nation. There was a few of us, myself included, who just kept going deeper and deeper down rabbit holes. We just loved the weaving so much, we just kept doing it, like outside of the sash weaving. And I just got excited. It's just neat. There's so many ways you can go with weaving. With my art, I like to call myself a functional artist. I make functional art. I do some wall hanging style art, but for the most part, I like to make things that you would use. So because of that, a lot of times when I'm designing something, my first consideration is what it's going to be used for, how it's going to be used. Because from there, like, that'll definitely have some design specifications. For example, with this belt, it's going to be worn around the waist and tightened. It needed to be stiffer. It needed to have a little bit more denseness to it than typical cloth. So that's always my first consideration. And from there, how to make it look beautiful in that role that it's going to be doing.
In addition to the tansy yellow and onion skin orange I also created a darker yellow with the tansy exhaust, as well as some iron to darken it up a bit. And to get another color, I also over-dyed some of that yarn with some old dried hibiscus tea I had to get this brown color. So with the original white wool, Chris had 5 different shades to work with, and he created this beautiful diamond design. And this wasn't easy because we had a tight time limit and he had the additional challenge of working with whatever amount of yarn was left over.
In this particular case, because I knew that the yarn for the fabric was special, it was locally sourced, so it was more of a case of limited quantity, where if I messed up or if I designed something that was too large or long, I couldn't just go down to the store and buy another roll of it. Making sure that I saw how much of the yarn in the various colors and how I could incorporate those without running out of a particular color was the biggest consideration. Once you get to the weaving side of things, I find it's a very meditative art form. As you're weaving, you're like paying attention and you can see almost like a story unfolding, the patterns that just start emerging through the cloth. It's a very enjoyable experience to weave it, but then you can also give it away or sell it. And you know somebody's going to use that product and somebody's going to find enjoyment and love out of it because it's unique.
And here the finished coat is. It has that simple look and shape that I wanted, but with the naturally dyed stripe and belt as the main focus. And I love it so much. There are a few very small things that I maybe would have changed in the pattern, but overall, I'm so happy with how it worked out and how it all came together. This wool coat is going to be perfect for spring and fall, and I can also layer underneath it. I love that it can be dressed up or down, and because it's 100% natural fibers, I can also dye it if the white ever becomes dirty or less bright. This is a piece that I hope to wear for the rest of my life, and it just has such an incredible story that brings me so much joy.